This week, we'll expand on the ideas we raised last week and look a bit at the history of the archaeology of the Old World. This will give us a stronger foundation on which to build in future weeks when we begin looking at ancient civilizations directly. First, recall that modern archaeologists often sort archaeological cultures into one of four broad categories: bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. Recall, too, that the term civilization often implicitly equates to states, so most of this course will be spent looking at the histories of states in various parts of the Old World. These concepts have not always been used by those interested in the past, however, and even if the terms were used, they were not always applied in the same ways. The development of our modern ideas about cultural evolution, the definitions of states and civilizations, and how we have come to identify those things in the archaeological record is a long and twisting tale. Today, archaeologists seek to learn about the past in a very careful, structured manner, seeking those four sorts of archaeological data and applying the scientific method to test hypotheses about what happened in the past. Prior to the late 19th century, however, this approach to the past was unknown, and it wasn't until the middle part of the 20th century that almost all archaeological research worldwide was conducted in a scientific manner. During that century or so of development, much changed in the ways that scientists thought about human cultures in the past. This was the period during which the broader field of anthropology was emerging as a scientific discipline, and, in the US at least, archaeology soon became subsumed under that umbrella. So the ways that 19th century anthropologists thought about contemporary human cultures played a big role in how 19th century archaeologists thought about the past. Unfortunately, those widespread ideas were, by most modern standards, quite racist. For centuries, many European thinkers have considered European ways of life to be self-evidently better than other cultures. This isn't surprising. Most cultures consider their own ways of life the ideal and judge others to be inferior. This is a pervasive bias known in anthropology as ethnocentrism, and European scholars actually had some justification for thinking that their civilization was the best. Beginning in the 15th century, Europe expanded its control and influence to most of the world. This expansion, in their view, was the result of their cultural superiority. Thus, when European and Euro-American scholars began to systematically describe other cultures in the 19th century, it made sense to them to do so within a framework that ranked societies in terms of superior or inferior. The first broadly accepted theories of culture are today known as Unilinear Evolution. Scholars believed that all human cultural traditions began in a very simple, undeveloped state, small communities, simple technology, and so on. Then they naturally progressed through more and more complex forms of cultural behavior. All traditions passed through the same stages in the same order, though some progressed more quickly than others, and some became stuck at a particular stage, usually due to biological limitations in the people themselves, not being intelligent enough to progress farther. Of course, the European societies of the 19th century were the most advanced, most complex in the world, and therefore they were justified in dominating other groups. Doing so would only speed those groups' advancements through the stages. In the realm of archaeology, a Danish scholar named Christian Thomsen ordered prehistory according to the unilinear evolution of technology, from a Stone Age to a Bronze Age to an Iron Age. American Lewis Henry Morgan and Englishman Edward Tyler talked about the progression from savagery to barbarism to civilization. Other unilinear evolutionists developed similar schemes to describe particular social institutions, such as religion or government. What tied most of these scholars together was the idea that any culture at a particular stage was comparable with any other culture at that stage. To study Australian Aborigines, which Morgan called savages, one didn't have to travel to Australia. You could just look at some Native American tribes, who are also savages. And those same modern savages were stand-ins for prehistoric savages. The present and the past coexisted, with the ancestors of modern civilized Europeans having the same cultural practices as contemporary non-Western cultures. Archaeology and cultural anthropology were answering the same questions with different methods. Unilinear evolution did not emerge purely from European ethnocentrism. It was also justified, in the minds of many scholars, by the emerging science of evolution. In 1859, contemporary with many of the unilinear evolutionists, Charles Darwin published his magnum opus, The Origin of Species. In it, he suggested that biological traits that spread and became common were the best. Traits that became rarer over time were maladaptive and inferior. Darwin was speaking of purely biological traits, but the prevailing opinion at the time was that cultural traits like religion, government, and so on were also biologically determined. So other scholars applied his theory of natural selection to human cultural groups. Seeing that their own culture was spreading and dominating the globe, they naturally concluded that their own society was more advanced and hence better than others. Thus it was that the term civilization took on its first relatively precise meaning in the field of archaeology. The word itself literally means the condition of living in cities. But 19th century scholars added so much more to the concept. A civilization was the greatest, most advanced, most perfect form of human society. Its inhabitants were the best kind of humans, with the greatest intellect and the most developed sense of morality. Given time, all human societies would advance to this inevitable endpoint, but Europeans had gotten there first and had perfected the civilized way of life. Obviously, as time went on, archaeologists became more and more aware of how ethnocentric this viewpoint was. Not only does it ignore the great accomplishments of other cultures, many of which surpass Europeans, but it also limits one's scientific research. Whenever the question is posed, why did they do things that way and we do them another? The answer was always automatic. They didn't know better, but we do. At the turn of the 20th century, an American anthropologist and archaeologist named Franz Boas began promoting an idea that came to be called cultural relativism, that all cultures and cultural practices must be evaluated according to their own standards in historical contexts. In other words, you couldn't just dismiss another culture as inferior and savage. To do science correctly, you had to judge why and how those people lived according to the things they considered to be important and relevant. This opened up whole new vistas of research opportunities and knocked the legs out from under unilinear evolution. It also meant that archaeologists needed a new definition of civilization. That definition, which evolved over the first half of the 20th century, declared that a civilization was a culture with an urbanized, state-organized society. Of course, this just passes the buck a bit. It requires us to know the definitions of the terms culture, urbanized, and state level. We talked about the definition of culture last week. A culture is a group of people who share rules, ideas, and so forth that helps them to recognize, identify, and respond in social situations. That is, they live together and collectively agree on rules for how to continue living together. Since these people live together and cooperate, they share material culture with one another. We can recognize a culture in the archaeological record by identifying groups of people who share the same sorts of artifacts, tools, and lifestyles. So a civilization is a culture that has two specific traits. It's urbanized and state organized. In other words, it has cities and it's governed by a state. The concept of a city is one that many of us feel we have an intuitive grasp on, but actually pinning down a definition is quite difficult. Most people would say a place with a very large, very dense population, but that's a relative statement. Larger than what? Right? Denser than what? Is a settlement with 100 inhabitants a city? What if a settlement of 1,000 inhabitants? Is that a city? What if the next settlement has 100,000? Obviously, something more is needed than just lots of people. Your textbook authors break the concept of city down into 3 points: population size and density, occupational specialization, and organizational complexity. Most archaeologists today would agree with this definition. The first point is fairly straightforward. Relative to the normal settlement size, a city is bigger, often many times bigger. The second point is more complicated. Since cities have such large and dense populations, the difficulty of feeding and providing for those populations is extremely difficult. In smaller, less dense settlements, villages and towns, for example, everyone can provide for himself and his household. Virtually everyone is a farmer, leaving the village in the morning to travel to the fields to grow crops or tend herds of livestock. Every household is involved in producing the things it will consume itself. That's not possible in a city, where population has surpassed the local carrying capacity. Put simply, given the technology available to the culture, there are too many people living in the city for those people to feed themselves. They can't farm the neighboring countryside to grow enough food, either because the technology and crops aren't up to it, or because some fields would have to be so far away that it would cost more to travel there than the food was worth. So what's the solution? A hinterland. The hinterland is the region around the city, but outside of it, where people farm more crops than they themselves will consume. They then take the surplus to the city to feed or provision the urbanites. City dwellers, meanwhile, can't feed themselves, but they need to produce something to give to rural farmers in exchange for food. So they begin to specialize in arts, crafts, services, and other activities of value that aren't directly related to subsistence. In time, different city-dwelling groups specialize in different occupations, and they become economically interdependent with one another as well as with the hinterland. Thus, the city can't exist without its hinterland, and the hinterland is just a rural village without the city. But when you have a population that large, that specialized, and that complexly interdependent, the task of regulation becomes very difficult. Keeping all those people in line, doing their jobs, and coordinating all the exchanges and interactions is an almost impossible task. It's so difficult that some people have to devote pretty much all of their time to it. This is where the third point in the definition of cities comes in, and where cities are inextricably linked with states. A state, as we mentioned last time, is the kind of political organization that develops in the most complex, largest societies. Your textbook defines the state as a political unit governed by a central authority whose power cross-cuts the bonds of kinship. In smaller societies, most everyone is related to one another in some way, and kinship ties are enough to keep people behaving properly. But in a state, the population is so large that most people aren't related. A new social institution, the government, is needed to regulate behavior. The bulk of that government will be made up of bureaucrats, usually city-dwelling, political specialists, whose job it is to oversee just a portion of the government. Priests, generals, ministers of states, and so on. Since each one specializes in a particular kind of political decision-making, each bureaucrat can take the time to become an expert in that particular field, and hence can make the best decisions consistently. A king or other supreme government coordinates the bureaucracy rather than managing matters directly. Cities and states are not the same things. Some states exist without cities, and some encompass multiple cities. But the two are closely tied, and both are vital characteristics of a civilization. In fact, so closely are they linked that in many contexts, archaeologists use the terms state and civilization interchangeably. While a simple definition of a civilization would be an urbanized, state-organized culture, civilizations typically share more than just those two traits with one another. V. Gordon Childe, one of the most influential archaeologists of the 20th century, considered 10 traits to be common to almost every civilization. Most important and universal to all civilizations, at least according to Childe, were cities, states, specialization of labor, concentration of surplus, that is wealth inequalities, and a class structure. that is, social differences based on those wealth inequalities. The remaining traits are commonly present in civilizations, Childs said, but not necessarily universal. They're basically the results of the previous 5: monumental architecture, long-distance trade, standardized art, writing, and scholarship. Child was an Old World archaeologist, especially focused on the ancient Near East. These latter 5 traits are extremely common in all Near Eastern civilizations, but many exceptions exist in other parts of the world. So much for what all civilizations have in common. How are they different from one another? Keeping in mind the ideas of Franz Boas, each culture is the unique product of its own particular history, so every civilization is different in that sense. But on a higher level of abstraction, we can begin to categorize civilizations based on several criteria. For example, many ancient civilizations consisted of urbanized, state-organized cultures, but the cultural group, that is, the people who shared a way of life, was divided among many different states. In places like classical Greece, the state, that is, the political unit, typically consisted only of a single city and its supporting hinterland. That's the definition of a city-state, where the city and the state are the same entity. In addition to Greece, the early Mesopotamian, Indus, and Chinese civilizations were also organized around city-states. At the opposite end of the spectrum are territorial states. In a territorial state, the political entity governed by a bureaucracy encompasses multiple cities and their hinterlands, expanding to fill a large contiguous territory. While a king or other supreme government presides over the entire territory, governors or subordinate officials govern smaller portions of the state. Ancient Egypt is an excellent example of a territorial state, as is classical Rome and later periods of Chinese history. Another way of categorizing civilizations focuses on how they arose in the first place. State organization does not spring into existence fully formed, but is rather the end result of a long, complex social process that transforms smaller, simpler societies into states. As their populations grow, the tasks of maintaining social order and providing for their inhabitants become more complex, necessitating the emergence of state characteristics. If those processes of change and evolution are internal, we call the civilization a primary civilization. That is, primary civilizations become states because of internal dynamics of their inhabitants seeking to organize and control their own behaviors. Outside influences from other cultures are relatively small or unimportant. Primary civilizations include Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus River Valley, and China, among others. Although all of these civilizations were in contact with one another to some degree, most archaeologists believe that they would have developed substantially similar cultures in isolation. That's not true of secondary civilizations. A secondary civilization is one that develops state organizations under substantial external influence. These cultures are essentially given birth to by other civilizations, which may themselves be secondary to still others. In this case, the external influences of pre-existing civilizations cause the cultures to change. These influences may come through economic trade, military conquest, expanding religions, or any other route. Greece, Rome, and many other cultures around the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea were secondary civilizations, developing under the influence of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Let's follow the guide of your textbook authors now and shift gears to talk briefly about the history of archaeology in the Old World and the discoveries that have set us on the path to knowing what we know about the ancient world today. As I alluded to earlier, interest in the past has not always been scholarly or scientific, and the modern discipline of archaeology is a fairly recent phenomenon. While we have records of people digging for artifacts of past eras that date back to ancient Babylonia, most of these early excavations were incidental to other tasks. They were haphazard and mostly conducted out of mild curiosity. For most of the medieval period, European scholars were actively discouraged from examining the past too closely, as church doctrine taught to avoid pagan influences. This began to change in the 15th and 16th centuries, especially in Italy during the Renaissance. This period marked a revival of interest in the classical Greek and Roman civilizations, as new translations of ancient Greek literature became available alongside the Latin literature that had always been available. In addition to literature, known from copies of copies of copies, passed down over thousands of years, classical art also became more popular, influencing Renaissance artists in their own art. This classical revival came to a head a couple centuries later in the 1740s and 1750s, when the King of Naples, which at the time was the southern half of Italy, began sponsoring excavations at the nearby Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Both had been destroyed by the eruption of the volcano Vesuvius in AD 79, and their exact locations had only recently been rediscovered. The excavations at Pompeii were intended solely to recover Roman sculpture and art. They were more akin to mining than modern archaeology. But they made available for the first time huge collections of almost pristine ancient art. Antiquities were traded throughout Western Europe by the rich and powerful. Appreciation of Greek antiquities came slower to the European elite. They traced their own civilization back to the Roman Empire, so they were obviously more interested in Roman artifacts. Also, Greece itself was ruled in the 18th century by the Ottoman Empire, which was not on favorable terms with Christian Europe. Nevertheless, as the 19th century progressed, the Ottoman Empire opened more and more to Europeans, and Greek history became more accessible to them. One of the more important events in the rediscovery of classical Greek culture came when Lord Elgin, a British diplomat, purchased the sculptures from Athens' Parthenon, one of the greatest temples of Greek antiquity, and he exported them back to Britain. While there is still to this day debate over whether the purchase and export was legal, the Elgin marbles became the most visible and celebrated example of Greek culture in Britain for generations. Elsewhere in the world, the Ottoman Empire was also opening up to Europeans. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte, the ruler of France, invaded Egypt, which until then had been a neglected backwater province of the Ottomans, and he took with him an army of scholars. Much of what we know about ancient Egypt today is due indirectly to his invasion. The most significant discovery was the Rosetta Stone, a large black stone inscribed with the same message in 3 ancient languages, one of them Greek. Napoleon's army discovered the stone completely by accident, but since the Greek inscription could be read, it led eventually to the decipherment of the other 2, one of which was Egyptian hieroglyphics. Once scholars could read the hieroglyphics that were almost ubiquitous on ancient Egyptian monuments, they were able to quickly advance our knowledge of ancient Egyptian history and culture. The regions that had once been Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East were also controlled by the Ottomans in the 19th century. In fact, the term Near East refers to the Ottoman Empire, which Europeans considered an Eastern culture, but nearer than India. As Europeans began to explore these regions that, like Egypt, had long been neglected by Ottoman authorities, they found even more exciting discoveries. One reason that Europeans had been interested in learning about ancient Egypt was the role it had played in the Bible and the Old Testament stories about the Israelites. The Near East was even more directly tied to biblical history, and Europeans were even more excited to go there. One of these European travelers was J.L. Burkhardt, a Swiss scholar who, in 1812, was the first modern European to see the ancient city of Petra. This is the ancient city where the climaxes of the third Indiana Jones and second Transformers movies were set, by the way. Burkhardt's accounts of his travels sparked huge enthusiasm in Europe. One person who was drawn to the Near East in Burkhardt's wake was Austen Henry Layard, an English newspaperman, among many other things. Layard settled in the northern Iraqi city of Mosul, at the time a small regional capital of the Ottoman Empire. He dug at 2 large hills across the Tigris River from Mosul, These hills, called tells in Arabic, dotted the Near Eastern landscape and were known to be the remains of ancient cities. The problem was no one knew which tells were the remains of which cities. Layard's sites eventually turned out to be Nimrud and Nineveh, two capitals of the ancient Assyrian Empire. In the 19th century, the Assyrian Empire had been known from biblical accounts, but until the publication of Layard's work at Nineveh, no one knew it had been such a huge world power. Layard uncovered monumental walls and gateways, royal palaces, and an entire royal archive of government documents, showing that in its day, Assyria had been the equal of any other nation on earth. Unfortunately, none of those documents could be read when Layard discovered them. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphics, Mesopotamian cuneiform had not yet been deciphered. That would have to wait for the publication of the work of Henry Rawlinson, another English scholar, who deciphered cuneiform from a multilingual inscription in modern Iran known as the Behistun inscription. Like with Egypt, the ability to read Mesopotamian writing led to an explosion of archaeological work in the latter half of the 19th century. Meanwhile, work was progressing in Greece and the Aegean region as well, and archaeological discoveries were pushing farther and farther into the past. Whereas earlier generations like Lord Elgin had been content to acquire classical Greek art, later scholars took a more systematic approach. Layard's work had set a standard for later excavations. The goal was no longer to remove artwork from the ground, like removing gold from a mine, but to illuminate the culture of the ancient civilization. Into this context came the German businessman Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann was a self-made millionaire who'd retired young and taken a Greek trophy wife. He was also obsessed with the poems of Homer, the great Greek poet who'd composed the Iliad and Odyssey, two epic poems that revolved around the Trojan War. The Trojan War was the central event in classical Greek mythology, a 10-year-long war between all of the Greek city-states and a mysterious city across the Aegean called Troy. In the late 1800s, most scholars believed Troy to be mythical, a kind of made-up national enemy to unite the various classical Greek city-states, but Schliemann disagreed. Working from evidence in Homer's Iliad and spending his own substantial fortune, Schliemann traveled to Turkey in 1870 and identified a hill called Hissarlik as Homer's Troy. It's important to note that another scholar, Frank Calvert, had earlier come to the same conclusion. Schliemann and Calvert would go on to partner with one another to excavate the site and demonstrate that it was almost certainly the historical basis for the Homeric epic. It was Calvert's careful work, rather than Schliemann's rather amateurish endeavors, that really provided the proof. Having established that the Trojan War did in fact have a basis in history, Schliemann turned back to the Greeks. He excavated at the traditional sites of Mycenae and Tiryns and other cities mentioned in Homer, and showed that they had existed as large, prosperous cities at the same time as Troy. It was left to the early 20th century to push our knowledge of Greek history back even further. Greek myths talked about another mysterious foreign civilization on the island of Crete, ruled by a mythical king Minos. In 1900, an English scholar named Arthur Evans traveled to Crete and began excavation at the site of Knossos. He was looking for the origin place of a series of odd ancient inscriptions in a script heretofore unknown. What he discovered was that Knossos had been the center of a large, prosperous kingdom with trade connections all over the eastern Mediterranean, and a culture unlike anything on mainland Greece. Today we know that Minoan culture, named by Evans after the mythical Minos, was the first civilization in Europe, but it was not a European civilization. Native Minoans had a culture much more similar to their contemporaries in the Near East. Discoveries around the world continued throughout the 20th century, filling in both the map and the timeline with knowledge about the past. Sir Leonard Woolley revealed that Mesopotamian civilization was as old as Egyptian when he excavated in Sumer. We discovered that Indian civilization had arisen in the Indus Valley soon after Mesopotamia, And in East Asia, Chinese archaeologists began uncovering the remains of the very earliest Chinese civilizations at Anyang, which had always been remembered by Chinese historians, but was considered almost mythical. Today, archaeology is less about uncovering never-before-suspected civilizations and rewriting history books, and more about filling in the gaps with carefully planned, precisely targeted excavations to answer very specific questions. After several centuries, we have an excellent general understanding of our past. Today, we want details. The rest of the course will be devoted to studying both sides of that continuum, the broad and the specific.